The envelope landed on the kitchen table like a quiet accusation. Maya didn't open it right away. She stood at the sink, hands still wet from washing the 3 dishes that represented everything she'd eaten that week: a bowl of oatmeal, a half-finished cup of soup, a plate of toast she'd made at midnight when the anxiety got loud enough to feel like noise. Outside, November was doing what November does in Cleveland. Gray pressing down on gray. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, it just settles in your bones and stays. She dried her hands slowly. Deliberately. Like someone preparing for something they weren't ready for. The return address on the envelope read, Hargrove and Associates, Estate Distribution, Cincinnati, OH. Her grandmother had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since Maya had driven 4 hours alone in a car with a broken heater, sat in a funeral home that smelled like lilies and something older, and watched cousins she hadn't seen in a decade cry on each other's shoulders with the practiced ease of people who knew how to perform grief in public. Maya hadn't cried. Not there. She cried in her car, in the parking lot, in the dark, with the engine running for warmth and a gas tank that was already on empty. She picked up the envelope now. Opened it. Read the single paragraph inside. Set it down. And for a long moment, she just stood there in her small kitchen, in her small life, while the radiator ticked and the wind pushed against the window like it was trying to get in. Of course, she thought. Of course. Maya Celestine Archer was 31 years old and had been quietly failing for most of her adult life in the way that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No addiction. No scandal. No single catastrophic event that could serve as explanation or excuse. Just the slow, grinding erosion of a person who had tried very hard, in very many directions, and found that trying hard is sometimes not the variable that matters. She'd gone to art school on a partial scholarship and graduated with a portfolio she believed in and a debt she didn't fully understand yet. She'd spent 4 years designing logos and social media graphics for companies that paid her in exposure and experience before she realized those were currencies she couldn't spend at the grocery store. She'd had a relationship with a man named Daniel who was kind in the beginning and indifferent by the end. Who left not loudly but simply, gradually choosing to be elsewhere until one day he was entirely elsewhere, and the apartment felt like a stage set after the play has closed. She'd moved back to Cleveland from Columbus. A smaller apartment. A part-time job doing graphic design for a local printing company that was itself barely surviving. 22 hours a week. Not enough. The letter from the estate attorney told her what she'd already suspected. Her grandmother, Eleanor Archer, Nana L., who had smelled like lavender and old books, who had pressed Maya's face between her papery hands and called her my serious one. Who had been the single person in Maya's life who seemed to truly see her, had distributed her estate among the family. Maya's mother received the house. Her Aunt Patricia received the savings account and the antique furniture. Her cousin Derek received the car. Her cousin Simone received the jewelry collection. Maya received one item. A wooden box. Approximately 12 inches by 8. Contents described as, one decorative plate, believed to be of minimal value. Her Aunt Patricia had called the day before the letter arrived, which meant Patricia had seen the will before Maya had. Don't be upset, sweetheart, Patricia had said, with the particular warmth people use when they're delivering something they know is unkind. Eleanor loved you. I'm sure she had her reasons. The plate was just something she had on the mantel forever. Honestly, we weren't even sure it was worth keeping, but the lawyer said everything had to go somewhere. Patricia had paused. I'm sure it means something. Sentimental, you know. Sentimental. The word sat in Maya's chest like a splinter. She drove to Cincinnati the following Saturday to collect the box from her mother's house. Her mother, Renee, was warm and apologetic in a way that made Maya feel worse, that particular maternal guilt that isn't really guilt, just the performance of it. Renee pressed cash into Maya's hand. $40. Like a tip. Drive safe, her mother said. Maya drove 3 hours back to Cleveland with the wooden box in her back seat and $40 and the particular emptiness of someone who has just understood something about their place in a family that they had always suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. She put the box on her kitchen table when she got home. She didn't open it for 4 days. On the fourth day, she opened it because she had nothing else to do and the walls of her apartment had started to feel like they were holding a conversation she wasn't invited to. The box itself was plain. Dark wood, the grain worn smooth in the places where hands had touched it over many years. No latch, just a simple lid that lifted with a slight resistance, like it was considering whether to let her in. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet that had flattened with age, was a plate. It was about 10 inches in diameter. White ground, the kind of white that had aged slightly toward ivory. The border was a deep cobalt blue, painted in a pattern that Maya, with her art school eye, recognized immediately as deliberate and skilled, not the stamped uniformity of mass production but the slight irregularities of something made by human hands following human intention. At the center of the plate was a painted scene. A woman standing at the edge of a river. Willows behind her. A boat in the middle distance. The colors, blues, greens, a touch of ochre, had softened with age but hadn't faded entirely. Whoever painted this had painted it carefully. With patience. On the back, and this is what made Maya sit down slowly on her kitchen chair, on the back, in ink so faint she had to angle it toward the window light to read, was a small mark. A symbol she didn't recognize. And beneath it, in handwriting that was clearly very old, for the one who stays. She read it 3 times. For the one who stays. She thought about her grandmother. About the way Eleanor had always called her my serious one. About how, at every family gathering, when the cousins scattered to pools and televisions and the easy commerce of cousins, Maya had been the one who sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother and talked. Really talked. About the world. About history. About what things meant. She had always stayed. She set the plate down carefully. She pulled out her phone and searched for antique appraisers in Cleveland. Found 3. Looked at reviews. Chose one, a place called Hartwell Antiques on Prospect Avenue, because one reviewer had written, "He's the kind of person who treats old things like they matter." She called the next morning. The man who answered had a deep, unhurried voice. He said his name was Robert Hartwell. She described the plate. He said he could see her Thursday at 2. She almost canceled twice. Once because she was afraid of disappointment and once because she was afraid of something she couldn't quite name, the feeling that hoping for something makes you more vulnerable than not hoping at all. She went anyway. Hartwell Antiques occupied a narrow storefront between a coffee shop and a cell phone repair place. The window displayed a grandfather clock and a small oil painting of ships and an ornate birdcage with no bird inside it. The door had a bell above it that rang with a sound that belonged to another era entirely. Robert Hartwell was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like he'd forgotten they were there. He wore a flannel shirt. He shook Maya's hand with both of his. "Let's see what you've got," he said. She placed the box on the glass counter and opened it. He looked at the plate for a long moment without touching it. Then he put on his glasses, pulling them down from his forehead with the ease of someone who does this 40 times a day, and leaned closer. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing. "Yes." He lifted it. Turned it. Held it to the light in the same way she had. She watched his face for information and found nothing readable there. He set it down. Picked up a small magnifying loupe from beneath the counter and examined the back mark. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he straightened and said, "I'd like to do some research before I say anything definitive. Can you leave it with me for a week?" Maya felt the disappointment land before she'd consciously processed the words. "So you don't recognize it?" "I didn't say that," he said. He was looking at her carefully. "I said I want to research before I say anything definitive. Those are very different statements." She left the plate. He gave her a receipt with a careful inventory description. She walked back to her car and sat in it for a few minutes feeling the strange vertigo of someone who doesn't know yet whether they're about to be saved or disappointed. The week was difficult. Not dramatically, just quietly, persistently difficult, the way her weeks had been for the past 2 years. She worked her 22 hours at the print shop. She ate oatmeal and rice and occasionally a can of soup. She tried to work on personal design projects in the evenings because she still believed, in the stubborn and slightly irrational way that people who love something must believe. That her work mattered. That she was still an artist, not just a person who used to have artistic ambitions. She couldn't stop thinking about the inscription. For the one who stays. She found herself pulling up everything she could find about antique plates. Porcelain marks. Chinese export porcelain. English ceramics. Dutch Delft. She bought nothing and knew almost nothing about any of it, but she read. She read the way she used to read before her life got small, with that particular hunger that comes from genuine curiosity rather than obligation. She learned that certain antique porcelain pieces, particularly certain periods of production, certain marks, could be extraordinarily valuable. She also learned that the market was saturated with reproductions. That the difference between a piece worth $40 and a piece worth 40,000 could hinge on details invisible to an untrained eye, and that amateur appraisals were notoriously unreliable. She learned enough to know she knew nothing. On the fourth day, she called Robert Hartwell because she couldn't help herself. He answered on the second ring. "I know it's only been 4 days," she said. "I know," he said. He wasn't unkind about it. "I'm still working. I've reached out to a colleague. I'll call you when I have something worth saying." "Is it good or bad?" A pause. "I'll call you when I have something worth saying," he repeated. Gently. Firmly. She hung up and went back to her oatmeal and her evening design project, a logo for a local bakery that was paying her $300. Which she needed desperately and was grateful for, and also couldn't quite make herself care about the way she wanted to care about it. She kept reading. She found an article about a woman in England who had discovered an 18th-century porcelain piece at a yard sale. She found a forum thread where collectors argued passionately about the difference between certain Chinese export patterns. She found a digitized museum catalog from a major New York auction house and spent an evening going through it, not expecting to find anything, just because looking felt like doing something. And then, on page 47 of a 2019 auction catalog from Sotheby's, she saw a plate. She sat very still. It wasn't the same plate. The scene was different, not a woman at a river but a garden, with figures under pavilions. But the border. The cobalt blue border with its specific pattern. The general quality of the painting. The size. The period style. She read the catalog entry 4 times. 18th century Chinese export porcelain, Famille Rose, Yongjing period, circa 1723 to 1735. Estimate, $28,000 to $45,000. Sold, $67,000. She set her laptop down. Stood up. Walked to the window and looked at the November street outside, at the cars moving through the gray evening, at the ordinary world continuing to be ordinary. Her hands were shaking slightly. She told herself to stop. To wait. To not do the thing that people in desperate situations do, which is to transform a maybe into a certainty because a certainty would solve everything. She made herself go to bed. She did not sleep. Robert Hartwell called on a Thursday morning, 8 days after she'd left the plate. His voice was different. Not louder or more excited, if anything, it was quieter, more careful, like someone carrying something fragile. "Are you available to come in today?" he asked. "Yes." "When?" "Now, if you can." She was there in 20 minutes. When she walked in, there was another person in the shop, a woman in her 50s, professional looking. With close-cropped gray hair and a measuring quality to her eyes that suggested she was accustomed to assessing things accurately. She was introduced as Dr. Patricia Chen, a specialist in Chinese export porcelain who consulted for several major auction houses and had flown in from New York. Maya felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet. "Please sit down," Robert said. He gestured to 2 chairs they'd arranged in front of the counter, the kind of configuration that implied something was about to be delivered. He stood behind the counter with the plate in front of him, still in its velvet box. He began carefully. "I want to walk you through what we found," he said, "because I think you deserve to understand this fully, not just receive a number." Dr. Chen took over. She spoke precisely, without performance, which made everything she said feel more significant. The plate, she explained, appeared to be an exceptional example of Chinese export porcelain from the Yongjing period, approximately 1723 to 1735. The cobalt blue border pattern was consistent with a specific subcategory of export pieces made for the Dutch East India Company market. The painted central scene, the woman at the river, the willows, the boat, was executed with a quality and compositional sophistication that distinguished it from standard export work. The mark on the back, Dr. Chen said, sliding a photograph across the counter, a close-up she'd taken and enlarged, is not a standard factory mark. It's a painter's mark. Personal. We've been cross-referencing it. She paused. There are 3 known pieces in major museum collections that carry this exact mark. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam has one. The Victoria and Albert in London has one. The Peabody Essex in Salem has one. Silence. Maya could hear the grandfather clock in the window. The tick of it. Regular and indifferent. "What are you saying?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Dr. Chen looked at her directly. "I'm saying that we believe this piece was made by the same hand as those 3 museum pieces. Which would make it, if the provenance can be established and the authentication confirmed, which will require additional testing, extraordinarily rare. Possibly unique in private hands." Robert Hartwell, who had been standing quietly through all of this, cleared his throat. "In terms of value," he said, "we can't give you a number today. Not responsibly. But I want to be honest with you, we're not talking about hundreds of dollars. Or even thousands. We're talking about something that, with proper authentication, could go to major auction and potentially." He stopped. He looked at her. And something happened to his face, a softening, a kind of wonder that seemed to surprise him, and his eyes filled. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical overflow of a movie. Just filled. The way a person's eyes fill when they've been carrying a feeling longer than they expected and something finally gives. "I've been doing this for 34 years, he said quietly. "I've never held something like this outside a museum." He had to stop again. He took his glasses off, pressed his fingers briefly to his eyes, put them back on. "I'm sorry," he said. "I apologize." "That's unprofessional." "Don't apologize," Maya said. Her own voice broke on the last word, just slightly. She felt it, not the relief of wealth, not the explosion of joy she might have imagined in some fantasy version of this moment, but something older and deeper and harder to name. For the one who stays. Her grandmother had known. Eleanor had sat for decades with this plate on her mantel, had known, or sensed, or been told, that it was something extraordinary. And she had given it to Maya. Not to the people who came to family gatherings loudly and left early. Not to the ones who organized, who claimed, who positioned themselves for inheritance with the careful strategy of people who understood what was at stake. To the one who stayed. To the one who sat at the kitchen table and talked. Really talked. Maya pressed her hand flat on the counter and breathed. The authentication process took 4 months. 4 months of additional testing, thermoluminescence analysis, spectrographic examination, provenance research that traced the plate through Dutch shipping records. Through an estate auction in Amsterdam in 1887, through a private American collection in the early 20th century, and finally, in a discovery that Dr. Chen described as the kind of thing that happens once in a career, through a bill of sale that connected the piece to an order placed by a Dutch merchant company in 1729. 4 months during which Maya's life remained externally almost unchanged. She still worked her 22 hours at the print shop. She still ate cheaply. She still sat at her kitchen table in the evenings, but now she was doing something different. She was learning. Genuinely, purposefully learning. About ceramics. About the history of trade between China and Europe. About provenance research. About the art market. About auction processes and estate law and what it meant to steward something that mattered. She began to understand that the plate wasn't just an object. It was a document. It was evidence of a moment in history when human hands, skilled, patient, anonymous hands on the other side of the world, had created something beautiful for export to strangers. And one piece of that creation had traveled across 3 centuries and several continents and ended up on her grandmother's mantel in Cincinnati. She also began to understand something about herself. The desperation that had characterized the last 2 years, the quiet, grinding feeling of being small in a world that wasn't paying attention, began to change. Not because the plate had resolved her financial situation yet, but because of what studying it had done to her mind. She was using herself fully again. The same intelligence and visual acuity and capacity for sustained attention that she'd tried to pour into logo design and social media graphics for companies that didn't value it, she was using all of that now. And it fit. It fit in a way that her professional life hadn't fit in a very long time. She started writing. Not professionally, just for herself. Long documents full of notes and observations and questions. The writing helped her think. The thinking made her want to write more. By the third month, she had contacted the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem to ask about their piece. The curator responded. They exchanged several emails. He was generous with information, clearly delighted by the inquiry. He mentioned that the museum's piece had been donated by an anonymous private collector in the 1940s, and that they had never been able to fully trace its earlier history. She told him about her plate. Carefully. Without revealing everything. He asked if she'd be interested in speaking further. The relationship that developed from that correspondence would, in a year's time, lead to a partnership that Maya couldn't have imagined, and couldn't have been ready for, before those 4 months of learning. Before the plate taught her how to pay attention again. The auction, when it happened, was held in New York in the spring. The plate sold for $430,000. Maya stood in the back of the room and watched the bidding the way you watch something that is happening to you in a dream, with a simultaneous sense of presence and complete unreality. When the hammer came down, Robert Hartwell, who was standing beside her because she'd asked him to be there, said nothing. He just put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She thought about the $40 her mother had pressed into her hands. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen table in November. She thought about the box opening. The velvet. The plate coming into the light. She thought about her grandmother's hands pressing her face. My serious one. She didn't spend the money the way people in stories spend unexpected money. She didn't buy things. She paid her debt. She created a small emergency fund. She set aside a significant portion for something she'd been thinking about for 3 months, a project she hadn't told anyone about yet, because it wasn't ready. Because she was still becoming the person who could do it properly. 6 months after the auction, Maya drove back to Cincinnati. Not for a family occasion. Not for a holiday. She went specifically to her mother's house, where most of Eleanor's remaining possessions were still stored, boxes in the basement, stacks of albums, furniture that hadn't been sorted yet. She went looking for something. She'd found a reference, buried in her 4 months of research notes, to a detail she'd initially overlooked. In an old letter, photocopied and sent to her by the Dutch shipping records archivist she'd been corresponding with, there was a mention of the original order. The merchant had ordered not 1 piece but a set. A set of 4. The plate had been one of 4. She'd spent 3 months trying to figure out what had happened to the other 3 and had run into walls at every turn. The trail went cold in the 1887 Amsterdam auction. 2 pieces were simply unaccounted for in any record she could find. The third had appeared, briefly, in a 1956 insurance document attached to an American estate, and when she'd traced that estate, a slow, painstaking process involving county records in southern Ohio, she'd found a connection. A distant connection. Thin as thread. The estate had belonged to a woman named Margaret Celestine Howell. Her grandmother's mother. Eleanor's mother. Maya's great-grandmother. She sat in her mother's basement for 2 hours, going through boxes with a flashlight and the particular focus of someone who has learned to look carefully. Her mother came down once to offer tea. Maya said yes please without looking up. She found it in the 4th box. Wrapped in newspaper from 1974. Cracked, a single clean crack running from the rim to the center, the kind that dramatically reduces monetary value but doesn't change what something fundamentally is. In a small wooden box, different from the first, but similar in its plainness, its weight, its sense of having been carefully kept. Another plate. Different scene. The same border. The same cobalt blue. The same painter's mark on the back. And on a small folded paper tucked beneath the velvet, the other 3 belong to our family. Find them. They have always been ours. Maya's hands were not shaking this time. She felt entirely calm. The calmness of someone standing on solid ground for the first time in a very long time. Who knows that the ground is solid not because circumstances have changed but because they themselves have changed. She understood now what her grandmother had given her. Not just an object. Not just money, which the money had been and she was grateful for it, but that was never the point. Eleanor had given her a direction. A life's work dressed up in old velvet in a plain wooden box. A mystery designed not to be solved quickly, but to be lived into. The plate with the crack she placed back carefully. She made a call to Dr. Chen from her mother's basement, explaining what she'd found, her voice steady and factual. Dr. Chen was silent for a moment and then said, simply, Maya. Oh, Maya. I need help finding the others, Maya said. Yes, said Dr. Chen. I know some people. Let's start. Maya looked at the cracked plate in the lamplight of her mother's basement. The crack ran from the rim to the center, not cleanly through the painted scene but just beside it, leaving the woman at the river intact. 300 years old. Cracked and present and still here. She thought about what it meant to be told something is worthless. How quickly and casually that judgment gets made. How often the people making it have simply not looked carefully enough. How often the problem is not the object itself but the failure of attention, the willingness to look briefly, to categorize quickly, to move on without staying long enough to understand. She thought about what her grandmother had always seen in her that others hadn't. Not talent, exactly. Not intelligence, though she had both. The willingness to stay. To sit. To look longer than was comfortable. To be present with something or someone until it opened. Maya Archer is 33 years old now. She runs a small consultancy, 2 people, herself and a researcher she hired out of a university program that specializes in provenance research for private clients. Families who have old things and don't know what they have. People who have inherited boxes, attics, storage units full of what the world has told them is worthless, and who want someone to look carefully. She has found 3 significant pieces in the past year that her clients didn't know they had. She has also, more often, found things that are indeed worth very little in monetary terms but whose histories, when uncovered, meant everything to the families involved. A grandfather's regiment. A great-aunt's immigration papers hidden inside a picture frame. A wedding certificate in a language the family had forgotten anyone ever spoke. She writes about all of it. Long, careful pieces published on a newsletter that started with 40 subscribers and now has, quietly and without any advertising, nearly 9,000. People who are interested in the archaeology of ordinary lives. The things that get passed down and misunderstood. The things that get labeled worthless by people who were in a hurry. The other 2 plates remain unfound. She is looking. She is patient now in a way she wasn't at 31. Not resigned, patient. There is a difference that took her a long time to feel clearly. Resignation is the stillness of someone who has stopped believing movement is possible. Patience is the stillness of someone who knows that the right movement, made at the right moment, requires waiting for clarity. She still has the original plate. Not the cracked one. She left that with her mother, who looked at it for a long time and then said, quietly, she never told anyone about this. The first plate, her plate. The one that sold, she does not have the physical object. That belongs to a collector in Singapore now, who has agreed to eventual museum deposit. What she has is the box. The plain wooden box with the dark, worn grain. She keeps it on her desk. Empty now, the velvet still inside, flattened with age and time. Sometimes she puts her hand on it. Not reverently. Just the way you touch something that marks a before and after in your understanding of who you are. There is a question worth sitting with. How many things in your life have been labeled worthless by people who simply didn't look long enough? How many gifts, from the people who loved you most quietly, who saw you most clearly, have you set aside because someone else told you they didn't matter? And here is the harder question, the one that cuts closer to the bone. What are you carrying right now that you haven't yet understood the value of? Because sometimes the inheritance that will change your life isn't the obvious one. It isn't the house or the savings account or the jewelry everyone noticed. Sometimes it's the small, plain box. The thing no one else wanted. The thing that was set aside for you, specifically for you, by someone who saw what you could become before you could see it yourself. Sometimes the most important things in your life are the ones the world told you to put down. And everything depends on whether you're willing to stay long enough to find out. Written for those who were always the one who stayed.